Hello, I'm Christina Greer. Welcome to this special program about the insurgent grassroots groups that are the future of the Democratic Party. In the coming hour, we'll look at how their passionate progressive activism is converting anti-Trump energy into electoral wins while bringing thousands of new candidates into the political process, many of them women and people of color, as we approach November's crucial midterm elections. We'll hear from Steve Phillips, founder of Democracy in Color, a media organization dedicated to race, politics, and the new American majority. Winnie Wong, internet activist and co-founder of The People for Bernie. Jane Kleeb, chair of Nebraska's Democratic Party and board member of Our Revolution. And Nathan Rubin, founder of Millennial Politics, which showcases candidates who support the progressive values important to many millennial voters. This joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network is coming to you from El Barrio Firehouse Studio in East Harlem, New York. We'll hear from our special guests soon, but first, here's a look at how Donald Trump's election gave rise to a new constellation of loosely connected groups operating outside the Democratic Party structure, and how it led to a wave of progressive political action heading into the midterm elections. Can the Democrats take back control of the House of Representatives? And what about the Senate? Not to mention thousands of state and local offices.
Members of Congress, the President of the United States.
For decades, open borders have allowed drugs and gangs to pour into our most vulnerable communities.
Donald Trump's radical presidency and his repeated attacks on immigrants, people of color, women, and other marginalized groups quickly led to a groundswell of protest.
I work in healthcare, sir. It is complicated. The only one that doesn't believe that it's complicated is an orange-haired buffoon sitting in the White House.
A decentralized, distributed wave of progressive political action soon followed, organized by a new constellation of loosely connected groups operating outside the Democratic Party structure.
If you're like me, you've been pretty freaked out about Trump and his agenda.
Indivisible is at the forefront of this robust new grassroots machinery. Begun as a Google document detailing techniques for opposing the Trump agenda, Indivisible quickly became a mainstream media sensation by relying, like the Tea Party before it, on a savvy strategy of publicly targeting members of Congress.
I'm an angry constituent. You work for us.
Indivisible's passionate progressive activism overcame Republican control of Congress and the White House to stop the repeal of Obamacare. The group now has a staff of about 40, thousands of volunteer chapters across the country, and has raised millions from small donations made through its website.
No bid, no wall, America for all.
While groups like Indivisible and People's Action focused on stopping Trump's initiatives, other grassroots independents began trying to convert the anti-Trump energy into electoral wins.
There's definitely energy that has emerged against Trump since his election, since the next day, is not dissipating. It's growing, and we're seeing this in elections all across the country.
Dan Cantor heads the Working Families Party.
We have to have Democrats who put forward a progressive, populist, multiracial program that can really inspire people.
The People for Bernie, with more than 1 million Facebook followers and a major social media presence, is another important grassroots group. Co-founder Winnie Wong.
Participation across the board is necessary, and that means you have to show up for the protest, you have to show up to the phone bank, and on election day, you have to cast your vote at the ballot box.
This fall, 440 House and 34 Senate seats will be on the ballot, along with a plethora of state and local offices. All opportunities to confront the crisis of the Trump presidency and organize for accountability and pushback. Groups like Run for Something, Swing Left, the Sister District Project, Our Revolution, Flippable, and many others are drafting candidates, schooling them in campaign mechanics, and supplying everything from seed money to sample canvassing scripts. As a result, literally thousands of first-time candidates, many women and people of color, are now running for offices at every level.
We have to have candidates that look and sound like their communities.
Jane Kleeb chairs the Nebraska Democratic Party.
That definitely means less white, upper-class lawyers and more folks coming from middle-class and working-class backgrounds economically, as well as racially and, of course, gender.
One leading group trying to encourage such candidates is Democracy in Color, created to collect and share data on how Democrats engage people of color and to hold the party accountable.
The point about trying to make this a wake-up call to the progressive movement.
The initiative is led by Steve Phillips, author of the New York Times bestseller, Brown is the New White.
And so if 46% of the voters are people of color, is almost half the money going to be going into those different communities? Or are we going to be spending it on TV ads that are trying to chase the shrinking sector of the electorate that's the white swing voter?
Phillips says that communities of color are clearly not at risk of voting for Republicans. But if their concerns are not met and candidates who speak to them are not supported, they might just not vote at all.
Really, it's a call to arms of activists to hold campaigns accountable.
We have lost touch with the grassroots of the party. I think because we had such an amazing president and President Obama, that there became this comfort level and we forgot the basic rules of politics, that all politics is local and that you don't just magically win elections with a magical candidate, but there has to be infrastructure. And it's not sexy, and it is hard, and it is constant work.
The progressives will succeed in 2018 if we have candidates who are substantially better and more progressive than the typical kind of Democrat, who are putting forward a program that excites people, and for whom the volunteers, the massive number of people who want to get involved, that they can get excited about them. If we do all that, these Republicans won't know what hit them. And then we'll govern in a better way because we will elect better people.
Quite frankly, I hope that more Indivisible members, more the Women's March members, more of the activists that are in the streets on these critical issues, then run for party spots, because those decisions get made within the party. And if you're not at the table, then those kind of party regulars are going to be the ones making all the decisions. And without those new ideas, new things aren't going to happen.
Steve Phillips of Democracy in Color is also a columnist for The Nation, a contributor to the New York Times, and author of the best-selling Brown is the New White, How the Demographic Revolution Has Created a New American Majority. He spoke recently with our reporter, Sigra Trejo, at his home in the Bay Area.
The theme of this program is Deep Grassroots, essentially looking at a cross-section of national groups that are part of a new, distributed, and decentralized upsurge in political and electoral activity. How does Democracy in Color fit into this constellation?
So clearly after the election, there's been this outpouring of energy and activism, people trying to figure out what to actually do and how to be most effective in terms of fighting back. So our lane and our contribution are two primary areas. Really, it's analysis and information and inspiration as well around how the energy of the resistance can be channeled in a way to make the biggest difference.
Dan Cantor calls groups such as his Working Families Party, Indivisible, Color of Change, and Democracy in Color the ascendant forces inside the Democratic Party. And he says they're trying to yank and pull and prod the Democrats in a better direction, while they still operate outside the party structure. Do you agree?
There's a clear strategic tension within the Democratic Party in particular, and then within the progressive movement overall, around what is the right way to win and what are the ways to go actually about doing that. And so there is a school of thought that what has to be done is to figure out ways to appeal to those who aren't with us, to those who've either voted for Trump or inclined toward Trump, et cetera. And so that tends to, unfortunately, lend itself towards distancing oneself from people of color, from issues such as immigration and criminal justice reform, to the fear of alienating that sector of the population. There's another school of thought, which is that the way to win is to expand participation and to bring more people into the process. That is the new American majority, and that's what is all we need mathematically to win. And that's where time, energy, and effort should be focused, is around trying to maximize that vote. And so that's the tension within the progressive movement and the Democratic Party, is where do you focus your resources and energy? Whose issues do you champion? Whose issues do you distance yourself from, et cetera? And so I do feel that there is a constellation of progressive organizations who are trying to stand for a strong progressive message and increase voter participation. And that is the much more viable and proven way to actually win elections.
While groups like Indivisible and People's Action focused on stopping Trump initiatives, other grassroots independents like Democracy in Color began to try to convert the anti-Trump energy into electoral wins. Can you give us some specifics on how you fit in or don't with such election and candidate-centered organizations?
So we've really tried to work in partnership with organizations who are increasing voter turnout as the way to win, and who are doing the voter turnout work by trying to unleash the energy of the communities who've been oppressed within this country and who are yearning for justice and equality. In that process, those organizations have been able to get more voters out and to be able to actually win elections. And so our role as a media platform and as a communication vehicle is to elevate and empower the people and groups in the right places that are necessary to take the country back.
With all of that in mind, it brings up one essential question. Why is it important to have candidates that look and sound like the communities they represent?
So you have this profound inequality, which plays itself out in housing and education, in just people's hopes and aspirations and quality of life. So people who come from these communities, which are treated unequally and sit unequally in this country, want things to be different. And they want leaders to understand their situation, who can resonate with the things that they actually feel and experience on a day-to-day level, and who will become champions for addressing the inequality that they face. The people most likely to share that perspective and point of view are people who come from that community. And so that's why you have generally higher turnout from these communities for candidates who come from those communities. And so it's not a surprising reality, but it's a real one.
Literally thousands of first-time candidates, many of them women and people of color, are running for offices at every level. How can they best be supported by progressives?
What we're seeing with this wave of new candidates stepping forward, a lot of women, a lot of people of color, a lot of first-time candidates who have been motivated by what's happening within this country, is a whole broadening of participation of the electorate and the candidacies. The barrier, particularly that women and people of color face, is being able to get sufficient resources to run a campaign that can actually win. The work involved of organizing a campaign, building support, contacting your voters, communicating with them, putting together materials, etc. So all that takes resources. And we live in a country where there is a profound economic racial wealth gap, and where there's a profound gender pay gap. And so the candidates who have the easiest access to resources tend to be the better off white male candidates. That playing field could be leveled by the progressive movement. Are they going to respond to a dark-skinned black woman running for governor of Georgia, such as Stacey Abrams? Are they going to respond to Spanish-speaking Latino David Garcia running for governor of Arizona? That's the challenge of this moment. I have no doubt that this country can have in January of 2019 a Governor Jealous in Maryland, a Governor Gillum in Florida, a Governor Abrams in Georgia, and a Governor Garcia in Arizona, if they can get the resources. The numbers are there, the math has shown that they can actually win. Will the progressive community respond with the level of resources necessary for them to be able to win those races?
So you also say that you're trying to make this a wake-up call to the progressive movement and making a call to arms of activists to hold campaigns accountable. Do you think progressives have a race problem?
Progressives in the United States of America have a race problem because they're in the United States of America. And so this is a country which was stolen from the Native Americans, which the Southwest was taken through violence and bloodshed from the Southwest, and whose wealth was built on the backs of black labor from Africa. So this country has a race problem. This country was conceived in a race problem and has had a race problem from its beginning to now. So it's naive to think that there is not this type of a problem. So then the challenge, what do we do about it? And so then it's a question of the progressive movement, and a challenge to the progressive movement is can and will it move the level of resources to the right places, and then will it elevate the right leaders into positions of controlling significant budgets so that those budgets can be allocated in ways which are aligned with the demographic trends within this country. It's just a plain fact that the vast majority of well-funded progressive organizations in this country are run by whites. It's an indisputed fact that the people controlling the allocation of hundreds of millions of dollars of Democratic Party spending, by and large, are white. And so that's a problem in a party that's 47% people of color in a country which is getting browner by the hour. And so where is the commensurate response within the progressive movement? The progressive movement has an extraordinary race opportunity if they have the courage and the competence and the capacity to embrace what is happening in this country, change the way they've done business, and move resources in a dramatically different fashion.
Communities of color are clearly not voting Republican. Why should Democrats put so much emphasis on them? Aren't they safe Democratic votes no matter what?
The bigger challenge and the bigger problem is, are people going to turn out and vote? Those who come out, yes, will vote Democratic, but if you get lots more of them out, that's a revolutionary political formula for transforming who actually holds power. And so that gets back to the question of prioritization and allocation of resources. Progressives and Democrats spend close to $1 billion every election cycle, over $1 billion in the presidential election cycle. So how much of that money is going to be going towards increasing the vote of people of color, and how much of it is going to go towards television ads trying to change the minds of moderate white voters?
What would you say to those who decry your approach as identity politics?
So this country was founded on identity politics for white people. And so it is ahistorical as well as unhelpful to then try to articulate that those people who are fighting against preferences for white people are somehow advocating identity politics, when in point of fact we're saying just stop providing the preferences to white folks. So to win, you have to identify with, invest in, and connect with the communities who are oppressed and marginalized and discriminated against within this community, within this country. The good news is that those communities are now so large that if you do identify with and invest in them, and the good news is that there is a significant, meaningful minority of whites who believe in justice and equality for everybody, that's the majority of people within the country. There's a consistent, meaningful minority of whites who stand with progressives, with people of color, for justice and equality, and this has been the history of the whole country, right? From the abolitionist days to the civil rights movement, to the allies of the immigration and the dreamers. There have always been whites who have been on the right side. So that's important for people to realize. People of color are now 39% of all of the people within the country, and the overwhelming majority of them are voting Democratic and really voting against the Republicans. So what that means is that if we are focused on and attentive to the part of the white population that is progressive, we can win elections.
Welcome back. I'd like to begin by asking Jane Kleeb to react to what Steve Phillips calls the tension within the Democratic Party and the progressive movement over how to win in November. Should the focus be on the new American majority or on the missing white working class voters? Jane? Thank you so much for coming from Nebraska.
Yeah, and obviously we have a lot of white folks in Nebraska. Yeah. It's no surprise. But we also actually have a lot of new immigrants that are American citizens now, and Latino and African Americans in Nebraska. So for us, and I think it's true for the entire Democratic Party, you have to do both, right? Mm-hmm. You can't win elections with only focusing on one part of our base. I think we've done a huge disservice, for example, to unions over the past several years where we have completely ignored their issues and just expected them to turn out. That is true also for Latino and African American communities. So we have to do a better job of speaking to our entire base and making sure that we actually have candidates that look like our entire base.
Right. And in so many unions, depending on the type of union, people of color and immigrants are actually the new members of that particular union that are actually keeping it alive. So, I mean, just to open up the conversation just a little bit, are the Democrats taking sort of their grassroots constituents for granted?
I mean, when you look at, to your point about unions, onboarding people of color, immigrants who are American citizens now, and you look at the work that is being done by, say, the national domestic workers, you realize that actually is a true statement. And one wonders how much contact is being made to those workers, right? There are large numbers of American workers who I think feel cut off or alienated from the party. And a lot of those American workers are not white. You know, they are Asian American, which is the fastest growing electorate in the country. They are of mixed race. In California, you're looking at, you know, in 2020, you're looking at 90 million millennials who are going to come of age to be able to vote, and they're not all white. Right. So, you know, it's a big country. You know, we have 300 million people in America, and 125 million turned out to vote. Where's everyone else?
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't think that either party are doing a very good job of making necessary contact, you know, important contact with voters, and I think we have to do a better job in the Democratic Party to change that.
I would agree with that, and I would say even on top of that, when you're talking specifically about union voters, there isn't an equivalency here. Republicans are full-scale attacking unions. They want to decimate unions. So the Democratic Party has a prime opportunity to show solidarity with unions, to show support for unions, and to really kind of get them back as part of the base. So I think that's something that they should really begin to look into, is how do we really open that tent up and rebuild these unions that are being targeted on state levels and federal levels.
So, but you bring up this interesting point about the base, because it seems like so many large, big D Democratic strategists, when they think about the base, it seems to be white men that they're chasing. So the progressives are constantly talking about, you know, this kind of new brown is the new white, right? Sort of the new party, the Asian Americans that are actually the fastest growing group, the immigrants, blacks and Latinos who, you know, are there, citizens, and just need to be registered or need to be sort of activated to turn out. So why is it that the Democratic Party seems to have this amnesia every 2 to 4 years when it comes to really galvanizing sort of votes that are being left on the table? Why is this obsession with kind of the white male voter? In places, you know, they might argue, well, Nebraska's majority white. We're going to focus on Nebraska. But what do you all think is the reasoning behind that, and what could be a real solution or strategy?
I think there's a structural problem. So in Washington, D.C., where there are all the political consultants that advise where the DNC should spend money, where the DCCC should spend money, they're all essentially white males, right? They have been in this kind of political world. It's very rare that actually women in communities of color are at the table making those decisions. You know, even in campaigns, women and people of color aren't in the campaign manager positions. We're often told we should be doing field or communications. And so more of us have to be at the table actually making the decisions of where the money is going. And then the other problem is state parties don't have money. You have state parties that are running on budgets of $10,000 a month. And so decisions for the entire state. So decisions are happening at the national level, not at the local and state level, where we are actually in touch with communities of color and kind of more of the base.
She's absolutely right. And I'll add to that by saying now we're also seeing a groundswell of activist groups who are engaging in electoral work, right? And traditionally, over the course of the last 10 or 20 years, those activists have definitely not been at the table informing the consultants and also the candidates of like what their communities are actually demanding, right? So there's like this real disconnect between the communities and the activists who are on the front lines fighting for those communities and the consultants are in the glittering, sort of reception halls, and who are making, six-figure checks a year to essentially run television ads, around messaging that has been pretty standard, I think, over the last 20 years. It's been very, the Democratic Party has really run messaging that has not really evolved very much, and now that it's 2018, we're seeing a different demand coming from the grassroots, from the community, saying, what we want single-payer health care. We Black Lives Matter.
Right. We're seeing a different demand, but is the party itself actually giving us a different supply? So is the party actually changing up its strategy and decreasing these $1 million ads and actually putting that money into the grassroots to actually pull out some of these possibly first-time voters or dormant midterm voters who tend to be people of color and or immigrant groups?
I would say that the desire is there in sort of some of the party operatives. I think some of the party operatives who are at the table have that desire because they actually are aware that there is a real problem. But I don't think that enough has been done, and it's been very slow moving. And I think that Jane can probably elaborate more on that. But there is a desire there, and I think that's good, but it's not moving fast enough.
Yeah, and it's definitely beginning to change. And so Deputy Chair Representative Ellison at the DNC is certainly inside the building pushing for more resources to go to the grassroots and to go to state parties that can then support the grassroots. But I will say that the DNC is also not kind of, drowning in a lot of money. A lot of the donors have a lot of fatigue from the last election cycle and, quite honestly, from years of losing over 1,000 elections at the state level. So while we held, President Obama at the federal level, we were losing tons of offices at the state and local level because we don't invest in the grassroots. And one of the issues is let's just be honest, like, we turned our backs on unions, right? We had the opportunity to do card check, which would have made it much easier for unions to organize. And we held both Congress and the Senate and the White House, and we did nothing. You could say the same for climate change and for clean water and other racial justice issues. So when the grassroots pushes back on the party, I hear that, and you have to own that as a party, and now we have to decide, okay, so now what are we doing?
Will it be enough by November of 2018, especially since we're starting to see the grassroots rise up in primaries across the country, and depending on what state you live in, April, May, and June, and even September might be a little tense for sort of some long-term Democrats because you do see grassroots activists trying to grab these reins a little faster than maybe the party's expecting.
So I am cautiously optimistic, and I say that because you mentioned millennials earlier. 83, 85, 90 million millennial voters are now eligible to vote. We're the largest voting bloc in American history. And when you look at a target demographic that hasn't participated in a way that they should have in the past, these folks should be at least a core target when you're trying to activate new voters.
Right.
In the 2016 election, millennials turned out about 45%. If you can just get that up to 55% voter turnout, I mean, that's a lot of seats that are flipped right there. So target college campuses and swing districts. There are a lot of organizations that are popping up that are doing that work on the ground. So I am cautiously optimistic that despite some of these larger Democratic Party conflicts, if you will be an energy on the ground that says, hey, 2018 is important and we're going to turn out.
I'm going to follow up with you right after the break. Thank you all. We'll be back in a moment with more discussion of the deep grassroots, groups now reshaping the Democratic Party. I'm Christina Greer. Please stay with us. Welcome back to this joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network, coming to you from El Barrio Firehouse studio here in East Harlem, New York. Nathan Rubin, what issues and values do you think resonate most with millennial voters, and what specifically is your group doing to promote them?
So I think millennials really care about a number of issues. When you look at what the progressive platform is, those are values that resonate with millennials as a generation. When you think about climate change, it's real, it's happening, we need to do something about it. When you think about criminal justice reform, the drug war failed. We need to end mass incarceration and move on and find ways to better our system. When you look at LGBTQ civil rights, those are civil rights. We need to protect them. We need to advance them. When you look at women's reproductive rights, those things need protection, and they're all under attack from the right, and the Democrats have a real opportunity to take the lead and show the millennial generation that they care about these values that millennials believe in. So my group, Millennial Politics, we're a digital media company, and we showcase and shine a spotlight on the progressive candidates that are doing this work, the progressive organizations that are leading on these issues, and then we try to just push out content online, whether that's on our podcasts, social media, live stream interviews, as a way to help frame the narrative in a way that advances these progressive ideas.
And so when we say millennials, I mean, I'm always fascinated by this because we tend to lump them together.
Sure.
But then I oftentimes think of the visuals from Charlottesville and realize that those are millennials as well.
Yes.
So how do we really capture the millennials that believe in progressive values? Because we do recognize that there's another group of millennials that are sort of working for the opposite end of the spectrum.
Sure. Well, I would first and foremost say that in a lot of ways people approach generations as being 50-50, 50% are on the right, 50% are on the left. That's actually not the case with millennials. There was a great poll recently out of the Harvard Institute of Politics. It's more 70-30. 70% of millennials identify and want a Democratic Congress in 2018. The Trump administration and the hard turn right that the Republican Party has taken has really driven a lot of millennials away from their party. And I think the Democrats need to start catering to the values millennials believe in.
So, I mean, how do you all think that the Democrats could do better and should do better catering to millennials, especially in a midterm election year?
So I spend a lot of time with millennials. I'm like an honorary millennial, even though I'm not a millennial. I want to be a millennial. I think that we have to also kind of examine the economic anxiety that millennials are facing now and in the future. So when you look at millennials, the data is there and they're in debt. They're really facing insurmountable, staggering student debt. And the likelihood of millennials ever really paying that debt back is non-existent. So that's a reality. That's actually a reality that hundreds of thousands of millennials in this country are contending with every day. So never mind the concept of home ownership. That's far down the line right now. So because they're really looking at like leaving college and then looking at wage work, right? Retail service work. It's not possible for them to advance and thrive. So it's troubling, and I think that, like, you know, in 2016, the Democratic Party passed a fairly progressive platform. Of course, the grassroots on the outside were really pushing an even more progressive agenda, which is, you know, student loan forgiveness. So I think that, like, the party needs to start thinking about, like, what that looks like and what that really means. And I think that, again, Jane will be able to elaborate more.
Yeah, so the, you know, parties actually have the ability in the primary process to allow independents to vote in the Democratic primary. So that's not a federal law, that's a state-by-state law, and it's a party rule. So the Nebraska Democratic Party this year is allowing independents to vote in our Democratic primary. We're doing that specifically for communities of color outreach and for young people, because we know that they're tending to kind of vote and register as independents. We also know that the research tells us if somebody votes for a party 3 times in a row, they become a party voter for life. So we want independents in our party, and then we want them obviously to feel proud as Democrats and then re-register as Democrats and be a party voter for life. We're also running peer-to-peer programs. We know to turn out young people, other young people have to be talking to them. So we're training block captains that are assigned 50 kind of college doors and 50 kind of in working family communities where they're assigned 50 doors and they're knocking on those 3 times during the 2018 election. So, you know, you have to actually put in programs to turn out the youth vote. You also have to do media, which you talked about, but the kind of actual communication and saying we actually respect you, even if you're an independent young person, the Democratic Party welcomes you, the Republican Party does not. Those are the things that we have to do.
So as someone who works with millennials almost on a daily basis, you know, and I hear their anxieties definitely about student loans, about the job prospects or lack thereof. They're concerned about their parents' job prospects as well as companies, you know, close down. Some of them, you know, push back and say, well, you know, Professor Greer, you're asking us to vote, right? You're asking us to turn out in primaries and general elections, but we're just not excited about any of the candidates, right? So even in a primary, maybe there is a progressive candidate going up against an old school Democrat. That's in certain places, but in a lot of places, these aren't even competitive primaries. So you have someone who's been entrenched in big D Democratic politics, sometimes for decades. The primary is pretty much non-existent, and they're in a single party district, so the general is pretty much non-existent either. What do you all tell millennials who feel like you keep encouraging us to go out and vote, but who am I voting for? Right? In a lot of places across the country, I'm not excited about who's on the ballot. What do you say to those young people?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's good to recognize that they are rightfully skeptical of institutions. Millennials, myself included, we kind of came of age in a post 9/11, in the middle of the financial crisis, in a time when big institutions were really letting us down. You mentioned student loan reform. That's a huge topic. And when you think about how the government has really been using students as profit centers for decades, I mean, when you look at the interest rates that are on some of these student loans, it's outrageous. And I think that we need to just kind of start to meet people where they are and say, you're rightfully skeptical of the Democratic Party, and we understand why you feel that way, but we need you to get involved and not just vote in a primary. Think about running if it's something that you're interested in, and find a way to make a difference on a local level, because right now in the Trump era, what we're seeing with that groundswell of groups coming up is that everyone has a part to play and we should all be in it together.
No, so I want to go back to what I often tell my students, right? Think about running, especially my female students. I always try and encourage them to run. But I always remind them as well that Barack and Michelle Obama paid off their school loans a year before he ran for the presidency. So a lot of really talented young people are saying, I'd love to run, but I'm broke, right? Not only am I broke, but I'm also in debt. What do you all then tell young people? Because, you know, there's a reason why we see a disproportionate number of lawyers and businessmen running for office, because they not only have the personal money, but they actually have the networks of people with a lot of money to come in. What do you all tell young people who are interested but financially just not in the realm to do so just yet?
So I mean, in Nebraska, our state legislators make $12,000 a year. Okay, so you can imagine who has the ability to not only run for office, which is expensive also, but then actually serve in office. There's other pieces, I think, to our democracy other than voting and for running for office, and that's keeping those politicians accountable. So I often tell, you know, I have a 17-year-old, and when her friends come over, we talk about the elections and, you know, their choices in voting when they turn 18. And I remind them that if they choose to sit home, other people are making decisions about their body, other people are making decisions about our environment, and that it's our responsibility to show up at the polls, even if they are boring candidates, because that then gives us an ability to go and talk to them, right? So when you help elect somebody, you get to go into their office and say, I turned out not only myself, but I turned out my friends, and these are the things that we're expecting you to do as an elected official.
And this is why the power of protest and demonstration and marching is so important. It is a tactic and for people to stay engaged in the political process. And so what we're seeing, you know, in the grassroots and in the social movements is we're seeing, you know, continuous activity in the Women's March, continuous activity in the Dreamer Fight, continuous activity in BLM, right? It isn't stopping, and they're meeting. The crisis, I think, is fairly nuanced, but I do think that those who have resources need to recruit and train candidates to run for office, candidates who don't have those resources, to counter the you know, constant flow of like lawyers and you know, boardroom business guys and bankers who decide that they've had enough of their white collar job and say, you know what, I'm just going to loan myself $250,000 to mount a congressional run in this district where I know that I can win.
Right.
You know, that's not okay. That really has to change. So I mean, it's a big problem. You know, we have to get corporate money out of politics. We know this. We have to end Citizens United. But in the meantime, those inside the structure of the Democratic Party with resources need to start allocating those resources better to groups who are doing this very important work. And some of those groups, I think, were listed in the opening credits.
I called it the Oprah effect. When everyone's talking about Oprah should run, it was like, let's slow down. Maybe we need Oprah's money to run for us, right? That would actually be a little more helpful. But Nathan, it looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, so I wanted to echo what you were saying, but also say, yes, it's a big problem that needs to be addressed, but I think the solution is underway. We're seeing groups like Run for Something, like Flippable, like Vote Run Lead, She Should Run, Emily's List. I mean, Higher Heights, the list goes on, Collective PAC, the list goes on. People are trying to seek out and train and run candidates that are people of color, that are women, and I think—
Or women of color.
Or women of color.
Don't forget about that group too.
Not mutually exclusive by any means, you're absolutely right. But what I want to say is that work is being done, and it's really targeting the younger generation. So when you look at millennials across the board, they're diverse, they're well educated, they are waking up if they're not active already, because ultimately we have the most to lose in a situation where Congress is older, whiter, wealthier than ever before, and something is going to change, and it is changing in front of us.
Well, you said something that I've been thinking about quite a bit, which is the well-educated piece. Where are the Democrats in targeting people who aren't as well educated and trying to pull them into the fold with registration and also voter participation?
I don't think that they're there, to be honest. I want to be very frank here. I think that if the state parties were given the resources that they need, that they desperately need, then they would be able to do better work, state by state. But as such, that is not happening. And so you have, I mean, there's no, it's just impossible for me to imagine a consultant from DC thinking about ways to engage like the Asian American community in Flushing. It just, that will never happen. It doesn't cross their radar. It doesn't, they don't think about it, right? And so, you know, that falls on us in the grassroots, you know, and there are, you know, the Women's March, for instance, is running a voter registration program right now after launching a successful event during their 1-year anniversary in Las Vegas. It's called Power to the Polls, and we're partnered with Rock the Vote. And so the goal is to register 1 million new voters, and we're doing pretty well. You know, there are other organizations that are launching similar efforts, but again, it isn't coordinated.
Right.
And that's a risk because I always think of the other side and how well they're coordinated and how centralized
and how well they have been coordinated. All right, hold that thought. We'll come back in just a moment with more. We'll be back soon with more from El Barrio Firehouse studio. I'm Christina Greer, and you're watching a joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Welcome back to our discussion of the Deep Grassroots, groups that represent the future and some would say the present of the Democratic Party. Jane Kleeb, Nathan Rubin, Winnie Wong. Do you think these groups are succeeding in their efforts to push and prod the Democrats in a better, more progressive direction?
Look, I think that the DNC chair fight, which happened last year.
Perez versus Ellison.
Perez versus Ellison, with Ellison receiving over 200 votes, would likely never have happened if there had not been an organized effort on the outside from the grassroots pushing for that. The party members realized that they actually have an accountability body out there, and so that happened. So I always look at that, and that sort of frames my thinking around whether or not we can actually make the Democratic Party a party for all of us. And I think, yes, I think we are, really making some real progress in pushing the party forward. But I feel like oftentimes if we take 3 steps forward, some bad actor will make us take 10 steps back. And that's been evidenced with some of the news from this week from the D trip, acting completely unprofessionally, and sending out memos and saying, look, like, you shouldn't talk about gun control. This is not the moment to politicize it. You should informing their candidates to say, think about offering thoughts and prayers instead of politicizing this moment. Right. That type of politicking, that type of behavior, is really something that shocks the electorate, because if it just there's a schism between like the country and the people inside the office buildings who are making these decisions, but it reverberates because the internet just carries that message all around the world, and people are like, what is this? So I am concerned, but as an activist and as an organizer in the deep grassroots, I'm not willing to stop doing the work. I'm not throwing in the towel. I'm going to continue to organize in the grassroots, with the grassroots, and try our best to make sure that the party functionaries understand that like everything is at risk with this administration.
So it sounds like Winnie's essentially saying, this constant pressure of activism to sort of change the tide of electoral politics. Do you all think that will be enough in November? I mean, we're hearing things about a blue wave. Some people are even saying a blue typhoon could come, right? I mean, are you all sort of expecting that? Are you preparing for it? Are you sort of thinking that maybe 2018 might not be the progressive wave we think it is, maybe 2020 or beyond that, depending, we still have a nation? Yeah. I mean, where are you all thinking when it comes to that sort of activism to electoral politics cycle?
I think the only way we get the blue wave is if we're actually knocking doors and running programs like the Block Captain, having independents in our primary, encouraging competitive Democratic primaries, thinking that is actually good for our party, and not doing this circular firing squad. So, like, I am tired of Democrats hating on Democrats online, and Democrats, hating on Our Revolution, for example. Our Revolution has endorsed some of the most diverse slate of candidates on down ballot races, and has over a 50% win record. And so the way that we will have a blue wave is if the grassroots groups are working hand in hand with the Democratic Party, and that they're pushing each other, that they're actually pushing each other to both be better. Because the grassroots groups can't win elections without the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party can't win elections without the grassroots.
And I would just add there that the activism on the ground is incredibly important, but even the narrative online is also important. When you look at the response to how the DCCC has sent out that Thoughts and Prayers memo, as well as some of the work that they were doing in the primaries down in Texas, they got a lot of pushback, and it came very swiftly and loudly from the internet, just by the way that it travels on Twitter and Facebook, through podcasts. And I think to your question of, is it pushing them left? I don't know if it's pushing them left, but I definitely think it's making them reevaluate how they're approaching these issues.
I also don't think of like the DCCC as anything other than like a signifier. It's like a repository for like money that they then dole out to consultants. So that is how I see the DCCC. It's literally just, they send out an email and they say, express donate $3. And then that's about it, right? Like, and then they offer their consultants to the candidates, and they say, you really actually have to use our consultants, or we won't give you any money. Right. And that has failed. That particular strategy is exactly the reason why the Democratic Party has lost 1,000 seats over the past 10 years. Right. And now what I do believe will happen is the campaigns that have staffed up with organizers will win. And there are a few of them that I could name right now, and I know this because I've actually personally helped to staff those campaigns with good organizers who are putting together important organizing programs so that volunteers and field people will do that important voter contact that is necessary for you to win. You have to do that persuasion at the door. Right. You have to do that persuasion on the phone. You have to do all of that. It's very hard work. It isn't TV ads that like win a race. It's actually going to town halls, meeting with like your future constituents, door knocking, phone banking, peer-to-peer texting. That's what is going to like help a candidate across the finish line.
What you all are saying, though, seems like strategic common sense. But we also know that this is not necessarily what the party is doing. So if we think back to, say, Alabama, right? The Democrats flooded Alabama with money, but they went with the TV ads. They didn't go door knocking. It was independent activist groups, black women, other groups that raised money on the side, that knocked on doors, that had block captains, that got young people involved. So Doug Jones wins over Roy Moore. So it seems as though the Democratic Party and the DCCC and the DNC keep going back to the well. And so I guess my question is, if we know this is happening, and we have activists that are working hard, but it seems as though they're kind of working hopefully in congruence with the Democratic Party, but it also seems like they're working side by side on two totally different tracks. Will that be enough then by 2018 to have substantive change for the Democratic Party?
So I definitely think we're going to have substantive winning of elections. It's not yet enough to change the Democratic Party.
Now, will those wins be because of an anti-Trump vote or a pro-Democratic vote? Which are two totally different things.
Which are two different things, but I actually think it'll be a combination of the both. But then I also think for 2020, it's going to take people like us here actually working inside state parties, working inside the DNC, because we can't just be pushing from the outside. We have to be pushing from the inside as well. I will tell you, with the DCCC and with the DNC, I go in there and tell them, this is what I want resources spent on. I want to hire a constituency director that's going to be doing work with new immigrants, African Americans, and Latinos. All state chairs can do that and can push on how money is spent in their states. Not enough of us do it, and quite frankly, not enough activist chairs are in these roles, right? I'm a grassroots activist who ran to become chair, and we need more of us inside those institutions making those decisions.
So someone watching the show who sort of wants to be more engaged, or who already is engaged in their community, how do they sort of translate that into electoral politics?
Yeah.
You know, so because they don't necessarily want to be a candidate, but how do they sort of get involved in kind of what seems as though these jobs that are behind the curtain?
I would say first and foremost, get involved with your local Democratic Party, but at the same time, check out your local indivisible group and see if you can go to events of both groups and kind of work on the inside and the outside, because that way you're working within the system, but you're also building that network of people that may be skeptical of the Democratic Party, and then you can kind of be that bridge there between the two.
He's right. I mean, I think that like the Bernie Sanders inside-outside strategy is very effective. Two of the people are sitting here in the audience. I'm very much on the outside. People for Bernie is an outside group, but I work very closely with people on the inside, including Our Revolution and even the senator himself. And you know, we have over the course of the last year really pushed to advance issues like Medicare for all, right? Which is now, there's no compromise there, right? It's a litmus test. So single payer healthcare is a litmus test for the party. You know, to Jane's point earlier, the down ballot work being done by Our Revolution is extremely important. You know, there are now over 500 local chapters of Our Revolution that you could join all around the country. So I would encourage viewers to find an Our Revolution chapter they can join. Our Revolution isn't about Bernie Sanders. Our Revolution is about our democracy. You know, so it's important to remember that. I always think of that. I don't think of Our Revolution as Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is Bernie Sanders. We love him. He's great. He's doing his job as a United States Senator. Our Revolution is trying to elect people from communities to represent those communities in school boards, right? In city council seats, in mayoral seats. And so join an Our Revolution local chapter and really do the research for yourself. You know, give $27 to Swing Left if you're in a district that you know that they're doing, you know, good work in. There are options, and our hope, I think, in the grassroots is to not blow it all up. I think that like we're offering really sane perspectives here, and also pretty salient advice, I think, to any Democratic Party operative who would be tuning into this program, that we're here to actually work with you, to help you, that we actually have good advice to give, and we're acting in good faith here. And so let's not send out emails. Let's not put up opposition research to a good candidate in Texas. You know, let's not do those types of things, because the media has no loyalty to the Democratic Party. They're reporters. They're going to report what they see. You know?
Right.
So it's like, has the DCCC ever received so much coverage in history as they have in the last week, where you have The Guardian, and you have Washington Post, and you have Intercept, and you have all these, you know, big media brands reporting on absolute just nonsense, shenanigans, really, right? And then the rest of the country sees it, and they're just like, forget the Democratic Party, you know, and that's not good. We have to stop that. I hope they're listening.
Right. Let's hope. Okay, so we're almost out of time, but are there any particular issues that you all think should be at the forefront of any Democrat who calls himself a progressive? You know, one or two issues that we think, you all possibly think collectively we need to make sure stay on the table as all these other things come up. Can you all sort of briefly give me something that's on your minds?
No cuts to Social Security.
No cuts.
Hands off Medicaid. We can't do that. You know, I mean, our seniors will die.
I would say that we need a Democratic Party that says flat out, healthcare is a human right, and I think we need a Democratic Party that will lean into the gun reform debate and not shy away. We've seen it play out time and time again, and it's one of those things where people are tired of it. And when you look at the polling on something like universal background checks, that polls at 95, 97%. We need a party that will stand up and just say, we're going to get this done.
Jane?
I'll say an issue that people don't mostly talk about in Democrats, and it's property rights. You know, Donald Trump would actually have to use eminent domain in order to build his wall, taking away farm and ranch land. And corporations, with their greed, are taking farms and ranches and Native Americans' land away from them to put in very risky pipelines that obviously affect all of us with water and climate change. So that is an issue that is normally a Republican issue, and the Republicans have turned their backs on that issue, and it's something that, as Democrats and progressives, we should standing up for property rights.
Thank you all so much. Please join me in thanking our guests on this joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Thank you, Jane Kleeb, for your valuable perspectives on the too often forgotten rural and Midwestern voters. Thank you, Nathan Rubin, for highlighting the need to address the concerns of the young voters who are truly the future of the Democratic Party. And thank you, Winnie Wong, for your passion in ongoing activism and organizing. From the Manhattan Neighborhood Network studios at El Barrio Firehouse in East Harlem, New York, I'm Christina Greer. Thank you for watching our vital news series, Elections 2018, The Progressive Path Forward.